All right, well, welcome back to a named channel now. Well, the channel's named, but the playlist, If Shelves Could Talk. We have our next top 10 list with Jack Eddy from the Cardboard Herald and Kyle Frost, the name that I never say on any of my videos. From here,
I was thinking you were going to forget your name there for a second.
The last one I did on the timeout with GivePause, I was like, I need to say my name this time. Totally forgot again. So today we have something totally different. It's funny, Love at First Plays would have been a perfect one to record now, the day after Valentine's Day, but we're not. It's game mechanics that we love. So our each of our top 5 mechanics, and we sort of talked about it before. These are not big genres, though my list when I was making it, some are very specific little mechanics. Others, I guess you could see, is like approaching a genre, but we tried not to just say, you know, dudes on a map as like a mechanic.
Yeah, this isn't like worker placement as an overall encompassing thing, or at least
Right.
I don't think it's going to be, but it can be individual things within that are nice little flourishes that you're like, man, every time that comes up, I love it.
Yeah, so this is a lot of fun to put together. It's hard because my brain naturally goes to those genres, and to really like push through that to the mechanics that make them sing was a fun experience. So, Jack, why don't you start us off? What is and I can't remember, are yours ordered at all? Mine are kind of ordered, but it's not like a hard 5th through 1st place like last time.
Yeah. I don't think that these are necessarily rankings. I have an order in which I wanted to talk about them, and maybe there are some that I'm particularly more passionate about than others. But
Okay.
in this regard, this is just 5 things that I really like whenever it comes up in a game. So
Cool.
my first one is I split, you choose. Now, I grew up in a family with lots of siblings. In particular, my older brother and I were closest, and being the younger sibling, we were put into a lot of positions in which he would have to dole out food that we were sharing or toys that we were sharing or anything. And a common mechanism that parents will utilize is, all right, older sibling, if you're going to split them up unevenly and try to take the lion's share, well, you're going to split it up, and then your little brother gets to choose. Well, I love when that comes up in games. Yeah, I mean, it's just such a smart way of teaching important concepts about fairness, and also getting your comeuppance if you thought you were going to get away with some sneaky stuff, right? And I think that one of the most potent aspects of this that I can think of, or memorable aspects within a game, is probably in Castles of Mad King Ludwig, in which you're going to be putting out the tiles that the master builder of the round is saying where these tiles are going to be allocated to these different price points, and then everyone else is going to pay for them, giving you the money based off of it. So you want to incentivize them, but you also want to wring the most money out of them. But the game that I actually think of most when it comes to this in its purest form is actually cheating a little. I'll give a disclaimer. I'm buddies with the publisher of this game and designer of this game, which is 10 Gallon Tank by Winsmith Games. It's an incredibly simple game that takes maybe like 15 minutes to play. Everyone that I've shown it to has just been thrilled with it. It's got a very vibrant, beautiful fish tank theme, and the entire mechanic is players going around a table, splitting up these schools of fish into groups that are one more than the number of players, and then you draft them from there. And it's just such a beautiful, easily understood method of separating up these drafting pools, but it feels awesome when you do it, and you do it well.
See, it's funny because, and I'm sure this will happen more often, but as soon as you said, I cut, you choose, the first place my brain went was, I have it right here because I'm in my room this time, Tussie Mussy.
Oh yeah, Tussie Mussy is another great example.
And it's with the added like twist of that one of them you don't get to see. So it's that would be, as a parent, I can't imagine. It'd be like, all right, we have one piece of cake. Older sibling, you're going to cut it up, and then you're going to hide one of the pieces, and then the younger sibling has to say, I want the one I can see or the one I can't. That would just be mean. Parents, don't take that advice, unless you want your kids to just, be anxious all the time. But yeah, that's a great mechanic. My first one is blind bidding, and it's just it's kind of in that same category of like a good type of anxiety. Like I cut, you choose. But like aside from Tussy Mussy, where one of the choices is not seen, it's the anxiety comes from just, did I overbid? What are these people doing? And trying to, it really sort of like a social deduction game. It lives or dies on how well you're reading the table. It's my all-time favorite of this is QE, quantitative easing, because it's just so it's blind bidding to the absurdist possible degree, because they're for those who haven't played it, it's a bidding game, but there's unlimited money, because you are government, so you can just print more. And it's I played it with a person who's pretty high up, network programmer for US Bank, and so he's like, and someone else who does like quality assurance for money industries like that, and both of them were pretty uncomfortable with the whole concept of like, well, I really want this, so I'm just gonna bid $2 trillion or by the end, because at the beginning everyone is small, and then just like ramp it up. But to like look around the table and have to guess, and in a much more boiled down version, Rising Sun was the first game where I really experienced this, in the combat system of just like your stack of money, and where are you going to put it on those different warrior poets, or are you going to hire the Ronin, there's never been a time in any combat where I haven't changed my mind at least once before we're all like, okay, are we good? And somebody's like, no, and like moves one penny over, and then sometimes it's something you never would have imagined, which is a cool part in Rising Sun. You don't get in QE all the time because you can't see those other bids unless you're the auctioneer, and then you just have to stifle laughter when you realize like one person wildly outbid everyone else. But blind bidding, it's super anxiety inducing, but in a really good way.
Yeah, well, I was about to ask how you feel about it integrated into combat systems. I mean, Rising Sun is a good example there, but I'm actually thinking about the very storied old Dune combat from Avalon Hill's Dune, which had been re-implemented in varying degrees to like small or tiny epic kingdoms, and Scythe both have this aspect of, we're doing our head-to-head combat, and now we're both going to allocate a resource which both of us are going to lose out on, but one of us is going to be the winner. Maybe you don't even want to contribute anything to the battle, hoping to drain your opponent. It's a really nerve-wracking system that I appreciate, but also being susceptible to anxiety, it is one of those things that I am terrified of anytime that I get into a blind bidding situation.
Yeah, it's not, it's fun. It's on the list, I guess, it being here doesn't mean I'm always up for it, but it means it's always going to make a splash, for better or worse. Because it can definitely lead to those moments. It's the furthest thing from perfect knowledge, right?
Right.
And there are certain people or certain game groups or certain moods you might be in where that would just like not fit the bill. So yeah, it's not always my cup of tea, but when it is, it's so good.
Yeah, well, my number 4 on the list was chain reactions. And I know this is kind of like an ambiguous, I don't even know if you can really distill this into a specific mechanism or anything, but it comes from being a longtime fan of CCGs, like Magic the Gathering or something, where you play a card and you're like, now my plan has come to fruition. This gets 5 tokens, and I get 6 health, and you lose 2 health, and I do 3 damage to 5 different creatures or whatever it is. But when things just kind of pop off one after another because you just did one simple thing that earlier on in the game would have been inconsequential, but now because you've tuned yourself in a way, it just kind of works marvelously. I love it. You see this in some degree in games like Terraforming Mars. It's also in Suburbia is a really great example of this as well, because you have all these different synergistic tiles that may impact based off of their proximity to other tiles, based off of what's in your area or what's globally going on around the entire play, around the entire game, every player's burrow. But to me, there ain't nothing so purely distilled as gizmos. I mean, that game, by the time you're at the end, you're like, I'm going to build a red, which that is going to trigger 18 things. It's amazing and feels so good.
Yeah, for sure. I hear you, and the one thing that's holding me back from that also being on mine is being like the serial table nanny and rules teacher is so many times, and I'm sure you can attest to this as well. Like when a game you've taught, when you start to do well, just the looks around the table, they start looking at each other like, "You see this?
Yep.
We knew this was going to happen." And I'm just like, guys. You can't blame me for just having strategy. And then sometimes you're like, yeah, but you've played more, blah, blah, blah. But like, this is, I think, one of the mechanics where it can be the most eviscerating is when someone else is just like kind of getting a combo off the ground and you're like, okay. And even like when you're coaxing them through your turn, you're like, okay, cool. Yeah. So you get these things. You're like, is that good? Are you okay? So for my turn, and then insert like all these chain reactions,
right.
And the person's just like, emotion just drains from their face. But it is super fulfilling, when you, and the same thing, I immediately went back to Magic, like, not just like icy manipulator, just like I don't want you to not have fun, but like other things that are more engaging but still like playing off each other. Like I was able to get these 3 pieces together, so now my deck can really do something cool, and for sure. So this is a nice kind of counter to that in, there's nothing in most games aside from Magic with counterspells when you start just like going on a roll, that other players can do. But push your luck is a mechanic that I really like for, it can have those like big, huge, showstopper turns, but it also, just like the way that it works, it actually works as a pretty good catch-up mechanism, or it can. It provides an opportunity to take a more dangerous route that might get you closer to, if not past, the leader that, in other games you just would have to sit there and be like, well, I guess I'm losing now, and will forever. And, not just, so like Mystic Vale, an older game that has recently been coming back to our table.
Right.
If your turn just isn't quite good enough, or you're one of those mana things away from a cool card, you're like, all right, I'm going to try to, flip over another card. And like King of Tokyo, that sort of stuff. But, the code names, in code names where you can try for one more.
Exactly. Based off of the failed clues of the past, right. Or something. You're like, there's this lingering thing here. We can try to pick it up.
Right. And which is like the best two-sided sword, because if you miss it, the person whose clue you missed the first time is just like, I hate you even more. Like you still couldn't get, but in like more abstract ways, like, Formula D of how long do you stay in high gear. It's not really like strictly push your luck, like I'm rolling more, but it's,
well, at a certain point that just becomes like committing to strategies,
right? Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I suppose that's a good point. But yeah, push your luck, I like it. Can have those big moments. It can also sort of normalize players, because if you feel like you're, again, table nanny, be like, you know what, I'm doing really well right now. I'm gonna go for this big thing that could be cool, but if I fail, I'm not gonna have as big of a turn. Or the other people are like, well, we can't catch them unless we just like go for broke.
Right. And I don't know. Sometimes I feel like it can be the opposite of what you're trying to go for here, in that if I'm the table nanny or any player at a table and I push my luck and get something exceptionally good, yeah, it's going to feel good for me, but also it just felt hollow in the sense that the only thing I'm being rewarded for is my courage in this moment, right? But if I know that I'm either going to fail because I don't have enough points, or I'm going to win by pushing my luck, then my choice is pretty much made for me. I don't really like it when it's in that situation, but I do like when there's a little bit of baiting, just asking you to draw one card or roll one more dice or something like that. Ethnos is another really good example of this, with the third dragon that you know is lurking in the bottom of the deck, and you're like, oh, dude, I really want a set of 6 wizards right now, but, you know, that dragon's there. Should I draw one more card? And the answer is yes, you always draw one more card because you are a fool. And in that regard, it's something that's globally affecting everyone. You know, the end of the round may be better or worse for you. Maybe you want to drive the end, but that push your luck aspect isn't just affecting you. That's affecting everyone at the table, which I think is pretty compelling. As far as my number 3, this is something that I had to kind of reassess recently. This is a combo one because I couldn't commit, right? You know,
right, yeah.
These lists are so hard. And it's hidden action selection and programming elements. So I'm thinking of Game of Thrones, the second edition, the board game, where you are putting out these secret tokens and then you reveal them all at once and you choose what you resolve. And I was thinking, is that a form of programming? I mean, yes, you get to choose order of operations, but you're still committing to a certain pool of actions that are assigned to certain locations without the interference of different powers and that kind of stuff, which I think, yeah, it kind of feels like you're programming, just kind of taking an extra hand in it. But what really cemented this for me was a recent play of a new game, Small Samurai Empires, which you don't have the ability to choose what you resolve, but it's this really tight, really small area control game where you are playing as feudal samurai lords in Japan, and you put out your action tokens very similar to a Game of Thrones or Battle for Rokugan, both excellent games, but you have a linear resolution of going from the south of Japan up to the north, and then you put out even more tokens to either replace or be in addition to the tokens you've already resolved, and then go from north to south, and you do that 3 times and that's the game. But it adds such an interesting element of trying to guess what your opponent's going to do, what you're going to do, what you'll be even capable of when it comes time to be able to do that, and the individual resolutions when it comes time to actually do an attack or a move or add more soldiers or anything. It's confined to this larger region of the board which you place it next to, which can impact the timing, but it's something that you still have a hand in when you actually put it all out. You know, like, you choose which dudes you're going to kill when it comes time to kill something. You aren't necessarily confined to this specific tiny territory, and if I don't have guys there, then no one's going to die.
Right.
And I think that's kind of the caveat here, is I'm not that big of a fan of programming games like Robo Rally or something where just it's going to go completely off the rails and they're going to behave exactly as you committed to when you started programming. But when it's an action selection system and there's some sort of fixed resolution or, you know, something that hamstrings your ability to resolve in what would otherwise be kind of like an open area control game, I think is just really cool.
Where does the Eerie kind of fall on that continuum for you from Root, in terms of like putting their cards into the decree? Because it's not as super strict as like Robo Rally or Mechs versus Minions, where you're like, well, that's a useless turn now. But you have some flexibility, but obviously that hamstringing of your choices is just like, that's kind of the definition of their faction.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely something that falls within what I'm talking about here. It's only one specific faction, but that is what makes the Aerie so cool when you play them. It's what gives them their own unique flavor and their own unique strategic hurdles that you need to overcome. Basically, I like feeling confined in my games. I don't like having the entire gamut of options at my disposal, because I don't want to fall into AP, or worse yet, feel like, oh my god, there's too much to concern myself with. I cannot see through the matrix, so I'm going to limit my own choices and feel like I'm being a fool, like I'm not playing optimally. But when I do have small but significant decisions to make, I think that's a really cool way of restricting you.
Nice. So that is kind of goes right into where my third mechanic is action selections that change over the course of the game. So it's not worker placement is one of my favorite genres in general, but this is a subset of that, games where that worker selection changes. And in one of the cases, I do reference like the Lords of Waterdeep, in that buying those buildings, which for me is always my favorite part of the game. Which whenever I teach someone the game and they don't buy any buildings by the end, I'm just like, what's wrong with you? Like, that's the coolest part. But that's player preference.
I have to stop you here really quick. When it comes to Lords of Waterdeep, do you secretly always hope that you are the Lord who rewards you for buying buildings?
So funny you bring that up, because the first group I learned it with, we removed her from the game. Like we as an option, because it was the thing that we were already doing anyways, except it was like it's like 6 points per building, and so it was like just like extra reward for doing the thing we all want to do. We eventually put her back in, because then there are different strategies we found out. But in that like honeymoon period, everyone was building buildings, and if whoever got that person was just like, well, I guess you win. But yes, I did always hope that I was her until we removed her. So there's that, and it's like expanding. So kind of what you're like the opposite of what you're saying, where your options get bigger. But the two that that stick out to me for like the opposite is in Snowdonia, where you have the weather that affects you just can't build rails, or it makes it cost more to do something. So you have to you can have your idea, like you've come up with your game plan for the next few turns, and then you see 3 days from now it's going to be raining, and I guess everything has to change. And so you have this like bigger group of options that from turn to turn you might only have access to this. And then another one, I have it, look at that, not even on purpose, Age of Civilization. It's an old, not that old, but a Kickstarter game that kind of went nuts, and it just has like a bajillion different civs, and the action selection moves. So you have like your timeline, which is all these different things. You can hunt, you can conquest, and you have these 3 actions that you always have, and each of the 6 turns it moves 1 to the right, and then the 3 cards that are underneath those like perma actions are the other 3 that you have access to. And it completely changes the scope of the game, because if you have an action like hunt at the end, which benefits people who haven't built a bunch of technology, that might completely change. Like I want to capitalize on that then, or later, so I need to totally change the way I'm playing my game now. And just kind of, I think it also might just be the excitement of the repeat plays, because you can say, I would have done this completely differently had these 2 cards been switched, or whatever it might be. So it's that like tantalizing, like these are all the options, but you can only have these right now. So,
and it's always really exciting in a game like that, where you get to kind of break the options a little bit. Like if there's ever a power that lets you circumvent those limitations, it feels like this is the holy grail right here. I am the boss of the table at the moment.
Yeah, it's an awesome feeling.
All right, well, my number 2 is something that I think maybe, again, is this even a mechanism at this point? But I know it's something that we both love quite a bit, and that's asymmetry. I love when asymmetry is in a game, and I love when it's done to a really ridiculous degree. Now, we have games like you're wearing a Root shirt right now. That is one of the selling points of Root. Then again, it wouldn't be nearly as good of a game if it didn't have like a, you know, nice sort of similar set of rules that all of the factions have to work within, and then they just individually break it in really interesting ways.
Right.
But then you also have games like, say, Spirit Island. You have games that are just completely asymmetric sides, like the Coin series. I was playing Colonial Twilight recently, and in that, not only are your endgame objectives differently, not only are the endgame objectives different for each of the different players, but also how you operate within the game. But there's also some things that are older and less beloved, and one of the games that first completely broke my brain was Middle Earth Quest, which is kind of a progenitor for things like Arkham Horror, or I guess Eldritch Horror. Arkham Horror
Right.
Second Edition may have come before it, but it has some of that similar DNA in it. But instead of being fully cooperative, one player is Sauron, and the other players are heroes, and Sauron is actually kind of playing like a Euro game, almost spreading corruption across the board and working towards these objectives that will draw the ring closer to him, which is so fundamentally different of a type of game. Like, you don't move pieces in the same way. You don't even observe the board in the same way as Sauron. Your turn looks nothing like the game that the heroes are playing, and that's really exciting when it's done well and balanced in a method that puts, I guess, opposition and pressure on opposite sides that don't even behave with similar goals. I love that.
Yeah. A side note: I don't think I'm ever going to be able to watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy when Isengard is like going from this beautiful thing to this like horrible nightmare like mud zone, and not think of someone who's making a tableau builder like a Euro now. I'm like, oh, there's Sauron and Saruman just like putting their engine together. And it is, you know, we feel the same way. It's on my list as well, so I'm going to talk about it now. Asymmetry, everything that you've talked about, the obviously Root, obviously Spirit Island. I have not played Middle Earth Quest, but when you're describing that, a game that came to mind is Skulk Hollow, and just like one person's a big old meeple, the other one's a little foxen like running around. It's a totally, you know, you're within the same rules of the game, but you're just interacting with it in totally different ways. Or the Risk Star Wars, which is fantastic for a 2-player game. It's not just, it's apparently, I never played Queen's Gambit, but from the prequels, but I guess it's like a three front sort of battle, and the Empire is obviously different from the Rebels. But another, because asymmetry, I said, in, you know, gameplay and victory conditions, or, you know, what is that one called? I keep looking around now because I was behind something. Oh, Villainous, where you're playing totally different characters, but also games that allow you to become asymmetric over the course of them. And Spirit Island is both like starts asymmetric, but then like how you build your spirit from one game to the next is obvious. That's part of the magic of it, is that like if you have all the expansions, like that stack of minor powers and the almost as big a stack with the major powers, and just how you build that up. Or in Dice Forge, how you all have the same access to the same market, or Pax Pamir is another one that came to mind, where those ones you are starting the same, but then the choices you make by the end of the game, I think it's just as cool to look back at, you know, the distance you've traveled together and say like, wow, look at the dice, look at what I made over here. Or when you realize, you know, what type of court someone was building in PAX, that the reason you couldn't ever do that one action was because they were getting all those cards, and they were just like completely locking that down, is I think just as cool as when you open up a game and when you're all going around your factions, you're like, your faction does what? and you're sort of just like sticker shock of the difference of them. But it is one of my all-time favorite mechanisms of games, so it's absolutely on my list. So that was mine. We just piggybacked on that one together. So what is your it's not necessarily top of the mountain, but your fifth and final mechanism that you love?
Yeah, I wanted it to bring it back around to something that is a little bit more specific. You know, like I wanted to get away from the broader concepts and away from the more genre-esque stuff as we were trying to do for the preparation for this list. And I wanted something that's just a really cool flourish that every time I see it, I love it. And one of my favorite types of games, one of my favorite genres is worker placement. And I love worker displacement. Like anytime in which your worker can interact with an occupied spot, but at a cost, usually bouncing a worker back to someone, or it takes a lot more to go to that spot. I think it is such a cool way of allowing you to fully interact with the board, but you still have to be aware of not just what is this going to cost you, but what are you empowering other people to do. Now, you could look at games like Lancaster, or you could look at Charterstone. But I think that the king of this, in my mind, is another Stonemaier game, and that's Euphoria. The first time in which I saw this sort of like tempo-based worker placement and displacement, where it is so helpful for someone else. If you bounce a worker back to them, you're saving them an entire turn where they don't have to recall all their workers, and that is meaningful. But if you really need a spot, you all of a sudden can evaluate those consequences and say, this actually means it for me. Like I feel like I got to take advantage of this here. So anytime in which there's worker bumping or being able to take advantage of spots at additional cost, whatever it is, that extra level of worker placement I think is so cool.
Yeah. The Dice Forge I just mentioned says the same thing, and why low player counts. I thought it was going to be not as fun of a game because that doesn't happen as often. It's still a fun game, but when it's 3 or 4 players, that that just it's definitely not the same. When you have to make that choice, like I really want this thing, and I know that person went there because they think I'm going to go there, and then that becomes this other layer of the experience. And in a totally non-worker placement in Irish Gauge, how often how long you can put off calling for dividends because you're like, nah, he's out of money. So he's going to call for dividends, so I'm going to build track. And then it gets to their turn, and they're like, I'm not calling for dividends because that's the one that helps everybody, and I'm going to do the thing that helps me. And it's just, it's obviously like not worker placement, but it's that other layer of cost benefit analysis that is a really cool decision to be made. So you went really like focused in, and I went kind of broad with my last one, and that is the inclusion of Automa or some sort of robo opponent in a game. And I love the ability to fill a butt into a seat that isn't being filled by a person.
I didn't know where that was going for a second there. Okay, got it. Fill a seat with a butt.
Fill a seat with a butt. That's a better way to say it. And it's just to make a 2-player game into 3, or to make a game, viable at all as a solo experience. Because as much as I love solo games, I really don't like a beat your score kind of. It has its place like for a really quick something, but if it's going to be anything more meaningful, I want to feel like I'm interacting. And I know it's not with a person, but sometimes some games can get their Automa to a point where like, okay, this is an interesting quandary you've put me in, Robo, whatever. And it's just, to fill out that space. So it's not, sometimes head to head is great, or a 3-player, all people game, but boosting that up by 1, and the 2 extremes are both good. They're the really easy ones, like in Wingspan, it's super easy, or Dune Imperium. You flip it over, you do the thing, it's done. And at the other end of the spectrum, Root and having to work your way through the actual like Clockwork turn, or forthcoming with Oath. I'm a little bit intimidated with the Clockwork Prince, to be honest. Looking at like the Clockwork Prince's brain, I'm just like, okay, but I'm excited to like see what sort of experience that's going to be, because with my obviously very few of us have experience like in person with that yet. But from watching gameplay of it, it seems like it's going to constantly sort of cycle through. So it won't always be, oh, you flip and then something happens. Or in Root, like they check for this, and you can kind of game that system. So I am excited to see what it feels like for a Clockwork Automa sort of situation that does sort of migrate around its space, which I guess some people could say like, well, if that's what you're interested in, just play a video game. And I guess, there is that. But
but I mean, the same thing could be said about even multiplayer games.
Right.
I mean, that's such a lame excuse at this point to be like, well, you could just play a video game, or, you're playing solo games, so why don't you just play a video game? It's like, come on, give me a break. I mean, because this is fun, and I enjoy having fun, and I enjoy playing with my toys, and I like feeling mentally engaged, and I don't get that enjoyment out of video games, so I get that out of tabletop games.
Yeah.
I love video games, but there are a lot of situations in which I'm like, man, I wish I were playing a board game right now. And as far as the Automa thing, I begrudgingly agree with you. Like,
best type of agreement.
Yeah, exactly. I hate having to rely on an Automa in order to fill out a player count. And there is a smacking of having to do more work than you really want to have to manage in a game, right? But when it's done really well, just like any of these mechanics that we've listed, they could be done really poorly or they could be done really well. And when it's done really well, especially as it's been done recently, I think that it can be successfully taking that role and filling out the board without having to have too much management. I really love the Clockwork expansion and the Better Bot project for Root. I think that the Wakan is a fantastic automated system for PAX Premier. Like you said, the Automas that are associated with the Automa Factory from Stonemaier Games. I tend to prefer when it's going to be a little bit easier to manage of a system and I'm not having to constantly look up, okay, in this situation, here is a flow chart of all the different things in which they're going to do and then have to resolve it. Root is kind of like my cap for that. And for a long time, I would be like, well, I'd just rather play a two-player game with it being a more open space and not have to worry about managing an extra thing. But Dune Imperium actually kind of changed my mind a little bit in that. I still hate having to flip that card because I can't tell you in the many times in which I've played it two-player at this point, I've forgotten to flip that card, and then it's like, oh, wait. I know you were just about to do what you were trying to do, but let's flip this card and let's see what happens. Okay. Now you can go there, but if you had tried going here, that would have sucked.
Or in combat, you're like, oh, I didn't flip let's see how many swords I got. Oh, the 6 swords one. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Great. So we all hate the Automa in this. But still, I thought for a long time about this specifically with Dune Imperium, and the options are you could either limit the amount of spaces that are on the board in a two-player game because that's what traditional two-player worker placement has done, or you could just leave it completely open and there's no obstacles, and that kind of takes the pressure away from a two-player game, and that doesn't really feel that fulfilling either. And Dune does a really good job of feeling like you have pressure without having to fully observe someone else's turn. And I think these new Automa systems are doing well enough that they aren't an obstacle to my enjoyment of a game, and they are successfully allowing me to play games that would otherwise only be playable at higher player counts. So begrudgingly, I agree with you.
Yeah, it's and it's not something I'm always up for, or in Root there's some factions I'm just like, oh, it's kind of more of a headache to deal with, but it's a really cool, I think it's there's a lot of stuff that's kind of flourished over the time that I've been playing hobby games, and I think that's one that has been just sort of captured my interest more than most, because it's something I didn't really anticipate. It's like board games is like for people around a table, and you're like, sometimes it can be this other thing too. But well, those are our top 10, our combined top 10. Well, I guess 9, because Assymetry we kind of both agreed, but
it's big enough for two of us,
right? Yeah, exactly.
We can both snuggle in the folds of Assymetry,
as I'm sure many other people will join us. Which speaking of which, I did have one. I tried to do the thing to invite other people into saying what their favorite mechanisms were, and I got only one, but it had enough for like a bunch. So Mike from Who What Why Cast said tile laying with Carcassonne, push your luck with Can't Stop, also push your luck with No Thanks, and brinksmanship, which I guess kind of go back to QE. Worker placement, so big genre there. Deck building and dexterity and co-op, which I've never played SEAL Team Flicks, but it has been one that's kind of been on my, this could be interesting, in the same way I love Catacombs when that gets out, and it seems, it's in that same genre, same mechanism. So thanks for checking out the video. Again, in internet time, these are coming out together, but we're about to go do something different on a totally different topic. So we're talking about people who've been playing games for a while, after we've marinated with all these mechanisms, and we're moving over to starter games. So if you are one of the people who can rattle off all of your favorite mechanisms, you're probably like us, you've got your opinions. But if you have friends who want to become like you, what games you want to give them to try out, and that's going to be over on the Cardboard Herald. Well,
come on, let's be realistic. People watch these videos because they want to disagree with us, or make sure that we're worth our salt and making the right recommendation. So this next video isn't going to be watched by new people getting into the hobby. It's going to be the veterans who are like, let's see what they have to say.
Ugh, you didn't include such and such. This is a worthless video. Yeah, so on that note, if we were wrong in our top game mechanisms, be sure to sound out down below and just say which ones you like better than blind bidding, or whatever it may be. Or, which games that we didn't talk about that use these, because they happen usually in more than one. So with that...
Impossible. We listed all the games ever made. So.
Yeah, exactly. And the mechanism can only be used once. And then, like a legacy game, you have to tear it up and never use it again. Well, thanks for stopping by. If you watched, Jack, thank you for being willing to, go back and forth, wax poetic about the reasons we keep coming back to games. It's been a lot of fun talking about these mechanisms together.
Thanks for having me on, Kyle.
Absolutely. Bye, everybody.
Bye.